I found out I wasn't invited to Thanksgiving on a Wednesday in late October, sitting at my kitchen counter with a pour-over coffee and the kind of quiet that money buys. The text came through at 7:43 in the morning from my mother, which meant she'd probably been awake for an hour, composing it with the careful deliberation she applied to anything that required concealment beneath a veneer of civility. "We're keeping it small this year, just Rachel's family. Hope you understand. Love, Mom." I read it twice, then set my phone face down on the marble countertop. The coffee was cooling. Outside, the November rain was moving in from the sound, that grey Pacific Northwest rain that doesn't hurt so much as it erases, softening the edges of everything, blurring the distinction between sky and water. I could see my reflection in the window, a woman in a silk robe at 43, alone in a penthouse, looking at a message that felt like the punchline to a joke I'd been living my entire life. I'd already ordered the gifts. A vintage Le Croisette Dutch oven from my mother in a colour the designer called a flame orange, but which she would never use, because my mother viewed cooking as a practical task, not a pleasure. For my father, a first edition of a biography about Warren Buffett, which I'd found not through any particular insight into his interests but through the same algorithmic guesswork I'd built a company on, the kind of prediction that turned data into money, money into security, security into the profound isolation of having everything except what you were supposed to want. For Rachel, I'd bought something for her twins, an educational robotics kit that I'd verified was age-appropriate, interesting, and expensive without being performatively so. The gifts were arriving tomorrow. They'd been selected with the kind of precision I apply to everything: research, analysis, optimization. Even my family contributions had been algorithmically perfected. I'd also planned to cook. My grandmother Eleanor had left me her recipe box, handwritten cards, some in pencil, some in faded ink, notes and margins about modifications and timing. I'd learned to make her cornbread, her cranberry relish with the secret bite of cardamom, her pecan pie that wasn't too sweet. I'd planned to arrive Wednesday evening and start on Thursday morning, the way I had for the past 15 years, my contributions quietly absorbed into the day like the heat from an oven everyone took for granted. The house in Bellevue had always been the gathering place. My parents had bought it after my father's promotion to senior partner at his investment firm, a sprawling colonial with a formal dining room that my mother had furnished from a designer's portfolio, all cream silk and mahogany, a room that looked like no one should actually eat in it. My parents had money, but they carried it like a responsibility, like proof of their superiority, the kind of wealth that maintained itself through discipline and judgment. They had been successful enough to view most other people as failures. This had trickled down to their parenting in ways I was only beginning to catalogue now, at an age when I should have been past the necessity of understanding it. I set the phone down and opened my laptop. I had a board meeting at 10, a call with an investor at noon, and the kind of calendar that had been engineered over 2 decades to eliminate the possibility of boredom or regret. The compensation for emotional emptiness is usually control, and I had become very, very good at control. But first, I found myself opening a file on my computer labeled the archive. It was a digital folder I'd created about 3 years ago, after a particularly successful exit had left me with enough time and emotional clarity to finally document what I'd been collecting since childhood: evidence. There was a scan of a photograph from my 7th birthday. I'm in the background, partially cropped, my head turned at an angle that makes my face hard to see. My sister Rachel, who was 3, sits centered in front of the cake, though she hadn't participated in any way. The frame had been chosen to feature her, and I had become a problem of composition. There was another photo from high school graduation. My mother's hand is on Rachel's shoulder. My father stands beside Rachel, his arm around her waist. I stand perhaps 2 feet away, smiling with the kind of forced brightness that children develop when they're trying very hard not to cry. The image is perfectly framed, and I am perfectly excluded from the frame's emotional center. There was a college acceptance letter to Stanford, dated 1997. Beneath it, a rejection letter from my parents, Explained in financial terms, the family could not afford to send both daughters to elite universities, and Rachel was still in high school with college on the horizon, so of course I would have to be practical. The university I attended instead was excellent, ranked in the top 50, a perfectly respectable compromise that had felt like diminishment. Rachel, 3 years later, attended USC without question, and my parents had leveraged a loan for her tuition without hesitation. There was a bank statement from 2004 showing the $25,000 my father had transferred to Rachel for her wedding venue down payment. The note in my file was a text message from 2003, when I'd asked my father to co-sign a business loan for my first venture, in Not Prudent. Too much risk in startups. There were credit card statements showing how I'd paid for my own business school education, working nights at a management consulting firm while taking classes. There were journal entries, hundreds of them, not the overwrought kind but straightforward, dated observations of small erasures. There were emails from my mother expressing pride in Rachel's choice of career, non-profit administration, and noble calling, and emails from my father to Rachel offering business advice, investment tips, references, all the infrastructure of intergenerational advantage. The contradiction was perhaps the cruelest part. When my business had succeeded, when the algorithm I designed to predict customer behavior had been licensed to companies across 3 continents, when I was approaching my first 8-figure year at 31, my parents had suddenly become interested in my professional achievements. There were Facebook posts about me. A mention in the local papers of people to watch a section that my mother had sent to extended family. But even that pride had felt like a comment on their own status. I was good because I reflected well on them, not because my success meant anything intrinsic. When I sold the company at 36 for $340 million, my parents had suggested I should have held out for more. I closed the file. The rain was heavier now, obscuring the mountains across the Sound. I thought about texting back, about saying something that would demonstrate my hurt, my anger, my decades of accumulated evidence that I had never quite mattered the way Rachel mattered. But I'd learned long ago that emotional honesty with my parents was like throwing words into a canyon. They echoed back distorted and diminished. Instead, I did something I'd been approaching and avoiding for years. I opened a new browser window and searched for catering services in Seattle. Then event planners. Then I called my personal assistant and told her I was cancelling everything on my calendar for the Thanksgiving weekend. Everything. Personal emergency, she asked, with the delicate concern of someone who'd been trained to believe I didn't have a life outside of productivity. Something like that, I said. I need you to help me plan an event. November 25th, very short timeline. I spent the next week orchestrating a kind of beautiful revenge, though I tried very hard not to frame it that way. I told myself it was simply about creating something, a genuine gathering, with intention and care. But the truth was more complicated. The truth was that being officially excluded had finally freed me to stop trying to exist within a structure that had never made room for me. It had freed me to build my own table and, crucially, to decide who sat at it. I'd inherited a property in the San Juan Islands about 4 years earlier, a 40-acre estate with a main house and several guest cottages, built in the 1960s by a tech executive who'd wanted a retreat but then realized he was too obsessed with his company to enjoy it. I'd bought it as an investment, had it appraised and catalogued and managed by a property firm, but had visited exactly twice. It was the kind of possession wealth accumulated almost accidentally, an asset that appreciated quietly while you paid attention to other things. It was, I was now realizing, exactly what I needed. The house itself was dramatic, all modern angles and glass overlooking a private beach, with massive fireplaces and heated floors and every luxury that money could procure. The guest cottages had been converted into Airbnbs managed by a local caretaker named Tom, a weathered, quiet man in his 60s who'd worked for the previous owner and had stayed when I took over, mostly because I'd left him alone to do his job. I called him on a Friday afternoon. I need to close the rental reservations for the last week of November, I told him. I'm hosting a private gathering. All right, he said, in that non-committal way of people who'd learned not to ask questions of people with money. How many guests? I'm not entirely sure yet, I said. But between 20 and 30. I'll prepare all the cottages, he said. You need anything else? I needed, it turned out, everything. I needed a chef, not catering but an actual chef, someone who could interpret recipes and create a meal that would matter. I needed to contact every relative I'd collected over the years, all the people who occupied the periphery of my family's life, the cousins in Portland and Denver, the aunts and uncles who'd been gradually distanced as my parents consolidated their social circle into something more curated. I needed to understand who'd been hurt alongside me, who'd been left out in the service of my parents' narrowing vision of whom they wanted to associate with. The phone calls took 3 days. I didn't lead with an invitation. I led with a question. Do you remember when you stopped getting invited to things? I asked my cousin Marcus, who lived in Portland and whom I hadn't spoken to in probably 6 years. Do you remember when my parents stopped responding to your calls? There was a long silence. Then, yeah, he said quietly. I remember. I called my Aunt Catherine, my father's sister, whom he hadn't spoken to since she'd made a politically liberal comment at a dinner table in 2008 and he decided she was too exhausting to maintain relations with. I called cousins and their spouses and their children. I called my grandmother Eleanor, who'd been gradually phased out of family gatherings over the past 5 years, ever since she'd had the temerity to suggest that my mother had always favored Rachel and that perhaps my mother should examine why. Eleanor, I said, I'm hosting Thanksgiving. And I want you to come. And I want you to bring anyone you've wanted to have at your table but didn't have the means to gather. My grandmother, who was 87 and had lived through enough injustice to recognize it in its quieter forms, began to cry. Then she laughed. Where? She asked. The San Juan Islands. I'm covering all costs. All you have to do is show up. The response was overwhelming. 34 people, ultimately, confirmed their attendance. I rented a large boat to shuttle people from the ferry landing to the island. I hired a chef named Diane, a woman in her 50s who'd worked in restaurants across the Pacific Northwest and who, when I explained what I wanted, not fancy, but genuine, respectful of tradition but thoughtful about execution, understood immediately. You're building something, as she said, not as a question. I'm building something. I agreed. Tom helped me prepare the cottages. He didn't ask why this mattered so much, but he showed up early each morning, checking heating systems, preparing firewood, making sure the grounds were immaculate. He'd lived long enough to recognize the quiet electricity of an act of reclamation. I was aware, through my mother, through a cousin who was still close to Rachel, that word was spreading. My parents had begun making phone calls, gentle pressure, framed as concern. We worry about your wanting to host something so large on your own. Rachel said you seem to be planning something very elaborate. The subtext was clear. What were you trying to prove? I wasn't trying to prove anything, I told myself. I was simply creating a space where being excluded meant you were in. I was building a table where invisible people became visible, not through performance or achievement but simply through being invited and shown up for. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, my mother called me directly. This was significant. She usually communicated through text, maintaining the distance that distance allows. Lauren, I'm concerned that you're doing something that might embarrass the family, as she said. Inviting all these, our people. Rachel said you've been collecting relatives like some kind of project. I was standing in my penthouse, looking out at the grey Sound, and I felt something shift inside me. It was the moment, I realized, when I stopped trying to explain myself to someone who'd made it their life's work not to understand me. Mom, I said, I'm creating a Thanksgiving. That's all. People who matter to me are coming. You're welcome to come too, actually. I think you should. We've already made plans, Ishi said, and there was something almost sad in her voice, as if she was mourning the failure of me to accept my place. I know, I said. I hope you have a nice dinner. The week of Thanksgiving, a storm moved in from the Pacific. Not the gentle rain Seattle was known for, but something more serious. Wind that shook the windows, rain that fell nearly sideways, the kind of weather that made isolation feel like genuineness. The ferries were running behind schedule. I kept checking the weather reports, not with anxiety but with something like anticipation. In a storm, all the usual structures dissolved. Everyone was forced to be present. People began arriving on Tuesday. My grandmother came with her partner of 8 years, a woman named Susan who my parents had never fully acknowledged. Marcus arrived with his husband and their 2 daughters. Catherine came with her adult children. There were cousin spouses, people I'd never met before but who showed up because someone they loved told them they mattered. There were 3 families traveling from out of state, people whose relationships with my parents had been quietly terminated years ago, people who'd been carefully erased from the family narrative. Tom had set up a large gathering room in the main house, with long tables arranged to create intimacy despite the scale. The cottages were warm and welcoming. Diane was in the kitchen, working with 2 assistants, filling the house with the smell of stock reducing, bread rising, spices toasting. It was already beginning to feel like something real, not a gesture, but an actual family gathering, the kind that meant something because the people in it had been deliberately chosen, not simply inherited. That evening, as the storm reached its full intensity, the power went out. For a moment, there was that universal moment of confusion, people checking their phones, looking for switches. Then Tom appeared with flashlights and candles, and someone started a fire in the main fireplace, and the house transformed into something that felt timeless and essential. We were suddenly in the kind of space humans had gathered in for millennia, candlelit, warm, protected from the storm. My grandmother sat near me, and I saw her looking around the room with an expression I'd rarely seen on her face, contentment. This is what I wanted, she said quietly. For someone to gather all of us back together. I didn't know it would be you. It was always going to be me, I said, and I realized it was true. I was the one with the resources, yes, but more than that, I was the one who'd been excluded enough to know what exclusion felt like. I was the one who'd learned to build things from the ground up. I was the one who couldn't accept being erased. On Thursday morning, despite the continued wind and rain, despite the chaos of trying to coordinate a meal in a house powered by a backup generator, something like magic happened. Diane had managed to prepare a Thanksgiving that honored tradition while being thoughtful about execution. There were all the necessary dishes, but they'd been made with intention. The stuffing used a mixture of breads, the gravy was slow-cooked and deeply seasoned, the vegetables had been roasted until they were caramelized and sweet. More importantly, there was Eleanor's cranberry relish with its secret cardamom, and Eleanor's cornbread, and Eleanor's pecan pie, prepared alongside everything else as a kind of foundation, a reminder of where generosity had come from. We sat down at 3 in the afternoon, candlelit still because the generator power was limited, with the rain still drumming against the windows and the wind still howling outside. And then, before we ate, my grandmother stood up. I want to say something, she said, and the room quieted in the way rooms do when an elder speaks. When you get to my age, you understand that family is not just who you're born to. Family is who shows up. Family is who sees you. And I'm looking around this table and I see people who've been treated as if they didn't matter, and yet they showed up anyway. They came because they were invited and because they wanted to be here. That is family. She looked directly at me. And I want to acknowledge my granddaughter, who has built something here that a lot of people couldn't do. It's easy to accept erasure. It takes real strength to not just survive it, but to refuse it, and to create something better. There were tears in the room, but they weren't theatrical tears. They were the quiet tears of people who'd been lonely in very specific ways, and who suddenly weren't. We ate for hours. There was wine and conversation. Children played together. My cousin's husband brought out a guitar at one point, and people sang, not in an organized way, but just in the way people do when they're warm and fed and with people who matter. There was laughter and there were stories, and nobody was trying to be impressive or perfect. Nobody was performing. There was just the genuine gathering of people who'd been kept apart finding themselves together. News travels in certain circles, and by the following day, photos had begun to spread. Someone had taken a picture of the full table by candlelight, and it had somehow made its way to social media. There I was, at the head of an elegant table of genuinely happy people, my grandmother to one side and my extended family arrayed around me in all their full humanity. The caption someone had written was simple: "A chosen family." The image began to circulate. Within 2 days, it had been shared thousands of times, had attracted comments from strangers moved by the apparent authenticity of the gathering. More importantly, it had been seen by my parents, and by Rachel, and by people within their social circle, people who began to ask, quietly, why Lauren's parents and sister weren't in the photo. Why the family had fractured in such a public way. A week later, my parents showed up at my penthouse unannounced. They'd never done this before. In 30 years of my living independently, they'd only visited twice, and both times by scheduled appointment. This felt urgent. It felt defensive. My mother was holding a photo album, which was her tell for wanting to access my sympathy through nostalgia. My father was wearing the kind of expression that suggested he prepared talking points. They sat on my furniture, which suddenly felt like a statement about territory. We wanted to talk about what happened, and my father said, "The gathering." We felt excluded. The irony was so complete, so perfectly circular, that I almost laughed. Instead, I listened while they explained that they'd never meant to exclude me from Thanksgiving, that it was just a miscommunication, that they hoped we could move forward. My mother opened the photo album and showed me pictures of my childhood, moments of genuine warmth that contradicted nothing and meant very little because context matters more than moments. When they'd finished, I set a folder on the coffee table between us. "I want to show you something," I said. "These are documents. Letters from my college years asking for financial support that you declined. These are transcripts from business school, which I paid for myself while working full-time. These are emails from you to Rachel offering investment advice and professional connections. These are text messages from your friends to Rachel congratulating her on her engagement before I even knew she was dating someone. This is a bank transfer showing you co-signed a loan for Rachel's wedding but declined to co-sign a business loan for me. These are journals where I documented, year by year, the ways in which I was made to feel that I didn't matter as much as she did." My father's face had gone very still. My mother was looking at the documents as if they might bite her. "I'm not showing you this for an apology," I said, "because I'm not sure an apology would mean anything to me now. I'm showing you this because I want you to understand that I see the pattern. I see it clearly. And I've decided that I'm not going to accept it anymore." The gathering wasn't about revenge or showing off. It was about creating something real in the space that your exclusion created. And I'm going to keep creating real things. And you can participate or you cannot, but I'm done shrinking to fit into your vision of who I should be. My mother began to cry, but they were the easy tears of someone who was used to emotional reactions being a way out of accountability. My father stood up. "You're punishing us," he said, "for not being perfect parents." "I'm not punishing you," I said. "I'm protecting myself. There's a difference." They left, and they didn't come back that day. But within a few days, there was an email from my father, surprisingly thoughtful, in which he acknowledged that he had been dismissive of my ambitions. There was a separate email from my mother saying she didn't understand how things had gotten so fractured, which was as close to an apology as she was probably capable of. Rachel reached out through a cousin. She wanted to meet. We did, at a coffee shop in Seattle, and she looked smaller than I remembered her, though I suspected that was just clarity. She'd been enlarged in my mind by her status, and proximity revealed her as simply human. I didn't know, she said, which was partly true and partly evasion. I didn't know how much they were favoring me. I assumed it was normal. You didn't ask, I said, not unkindly. You benefited from an imbalance and never questioned it. I know that now, she said. Seeing that photo, seeing everyone there, I realized how isolated I've been. How small our family has become. How much we've lost. We didn't become close. But we became something, which was honest. We acknowledged that we'd been positioned against each other, and that she'd taken the position that felt safer. And we agreed to try again, not from obligation but from the possibility that we might, if we were careful and honest, build something real. A month after Thanksgiving, we gathered again at the house on the island. Not everyone came, but enough people did. My parents came, and it was awkward and careful, but they came. Rachel came with her husband, and Tom had prepared the guest cottages again, and we cooked meals together, and there was the possibility of something like healing, which is different from healing itself but perhaps more honest. I stood on the deck one afternoon, looking out at the Sound, at the mountains visible now that the storm had passed, and I understood something I'd been circling around for years. My parents' inability to see me had never actually meant I was invisible. It had just meant I'd learned to see myself. I'd learned to recognize my own value independent of their acknowledgement. I'd learned to build things that mattered, not for their approval but for my own integrity. I'd spent 30 years trying to prove myself to people who weren't capable of seeing me. And then, in the space of a few months, I'd built something bigger than their failure to see. I'd built a table where being unseen by them meant you were suddenly fully visible to people who chose you deliberately. I'd become the person who gathered the lost, because I'd been lost and had found my way by learning that I'd never been actually lost at all. I'd just been looking for validation from someone who wasn't capable of giving it. The penthouse in Seattle is still there, clean and controlled and quiet. But it feels different now. It feels like a place I chose rather than a place I built to escape to. The island house has become something more real, not a vacation property but the actual site of something I'd created. The business I started after selling my company focuses on helping other founders build things that matter, and I take only clients whose work I believe in. My grandmother calls me regularly, and my cousins have become central to my life in ways my parents probably still don't understand. What I've learned is that family is not punishment masquerading as love. Family is showing up. Family is the deliberate choice to see someone, to make room for them, to honor their existence not despite how they fail to be useful to you, but because their existence itself has value. I built that table because I understood, finally, that I didn't need my parents to see me in order for me to be seen. I just needed to be willing to gather people who could. The story isn't about redemption or forgiveness or some neat resolution where everything works out. It's about the quiet moment when you stop accepting that you don't matter and start building a life in which you do. It's about understanding that being excluded from the wrong table means you have permission to build your own. And it's about discovering that the people who show up to your table, the ones who come because they were invited and because they want to be there, those are the people who finally, actually see you.